Well, welcome, and thank you for joining this presentation of a possible reorganizing of St. John's organizational structure. My name is Carl Hoppy, and I am a member at St. John's for the last 35 years. Have served on the Board of Elders as well as chairman, and I've been doing this work with Kyle Ruprecht, who's also been a member for many years. And neither of us are on any boards right now, which is part of the reason why Chairman Matthew Wilmus approached us in January of this year to say, "You guys have you're coming up on taking your year off of elected service, so I've got a job for you." And he requested that we take a look at St. John's governance, our organizational structure, our constitution and bylaws, and look at are there changes that can be made to address some limitations that um, have been recognized over the years. And also, this work is being done as a response to the self assessment and adjustment program that was that we did a couple of years ago through Wells Congregational Services. Pastor Jonathan Hine came to St. John's and we filled out some surveys and he had a number of recommendations. And one of them is to take a look at our structure and how we operate. So, what's our agenda? We want to take a look at first our current structure, just so you can have a bit of an understanding of how we're currently organized or what our constitution and bylaws tells us we should be doing. We're going to talk about some of the limitations that that structure has. Maybe talk about some new structure goals that we could use to address the limitations that our current structure has. And then we'll lay out and in our open forums, which our next open forum will be on Wednesday, November 15th at 6:30 p.m. at St. John's. I'll be able to have more of a discussion and answer any questions that you might have about what is being proposed. And it's important to understand a couple of other things. Number one, this is just being proposed. This is work that Kyle and I have done. We are proposing it to the congregation. We need to just continue to build consensus that this is the direction that we want to go. And this is also a structure that is being promoted within the Wells system. Our congregational services is utilizing this as an example, and there are other congregations that are using this structure, and we've been having conversations with some of those congregations so we can better understand the structure ourselves. So, our current structure. If you would have a conversation with somebody that was talking about organizations and wondering how St. John's functions, you might describe it this way, and as you describe it, they might have a picture forming in their mind that first of all, we have a voters' assembly. Our voters are men over the age of 18, and that are members of our congregation in good standing. And we also then, there's a church council that's elected, and then we also elect individual officers like a chairman, the secretary, the treasurer, and then there's different boards that we also elect. So there's a board of elders to care for the spiritual welfare of the congregation. There's the board of education, which focuses on primarily the school. There's the board of trustees that's looking at the building and grounds, making sure that things are being kept up to date, maintenance wise. There's the Board of Finance. These are basically our counters, and that count the offerings on a weekly basis. There's the Nominating Committee that meets a couple of times towards the end of the year, on this time of year, November timeframe, to start making recommendations to fill out the ballot for the annual meeting in January, and then the auditing committee that takes a look at our books, right? So we've got these different boards and committees. So it might look something like this in the person's head that you're describing our organizational structure to. But in reality, what we actually have is something a little bit more like this. And Doesn't seem like it's all that different, but first note is that the voters don't actually directly elect the church council. They elect those four individuals that are doing some of that work. But then the other half of the church council is selected from among the board of elders, education, trustees, and finance. So the chairman, they elect a chairman, and that chairman serves as their representative on the church council. Now, this has a couple of effects. Number one, it's also gets important to recognize that our constitution and bylaws at St. John's does not actually delegate any specific authority to the church council except for one thing. Our bylaw states that our church council's responsibility is to put together an agenda for our quarterly and annual meetings, and that's it. They aren't told what the extent of their responsibility is. And then also, then you recognize then that when you have a council set up this way, some of the members are elected directly, some are elected indirectly. Let's say from the voters' assembly, uh, because there really isn't. You lose some of the potential oversight of the activity that's happening at St. John's because most of the decisions and the activity that's happening is taking place on these different boards. So the council tries to summarize this and bring it to the voters, which creates some confusion that we'll talk about. So let's hit some of these limitations that we might have. Number one is finding officers to elect and having some choices in our electoral decisions. If we take a look at this, the number of people that we elect, you're talking, five individual officers, five or nine elders, five from the Board of Education, five from the Board of Trustees, 14 finance, so that people can spread out the counting uh, work that's being done. Three nominating committee, three auditing committees. So when you add all of that up, and keep in mind that these are all mutually exclusive positions. So if you have somebody that's been elected to the auditing committee, they can't serve on the board of elders. If you have somebody that's serving on the nominating committee, they can't be one that's counting the offerings. So there's some mutual exclusivity there that is creates a challenge then in making out your ballot because all told, we're looking at 44 men that are serving us as elected leaders at any given time. And the I guess tradition is once your time serving one of these boards is up, you have a year off before you're eligible to be put back on the ballot again. So when you think about that too, if you have on the ballot and you've got two names on the board of elders area and it says vote for two, or you have uh three for the nominating committee, vote for three. You really aren't given a choice. You aren't given choices as to who you're voting for. I mean, you can elect not to vote for one of those men, but the only way that once you're on the ballot, except in at this point, relatively few cases, the only way that you're not getting on the ballot or not getting elected is if absolutely nobody votes for you, and that's pretty much doesn't happen. So because people vote for in some cases, just for the people that are there so that they're willing. So when you raise your hand and say, yes, I'm willing to have my name put on the ballot, what you're really saying is, yes, I'm willing to serve in this role. So you're not actually being elected, you're kind of being appointed. And that's just interesting to think about in those terms and to keep in mind as we talk about our new structure that we are proposing consideration of. The next is uneven load on our elected officers. Nobody can deny that our elected officers, especially our chairman right now, has a very heavy load. We've gone from um, Matthew was elected in and started in 2020, and so 2 months into his service, COVID, and then we get out of COVID, and now it's been the vacancies that we've been working through, and so it's a very very heavy load, and not the other some of the other officers are certainly serving your congregation, but don't maybe there's not a way to have Matthew share that load with, let's say, um, the secretary or somebody else, or he's doing this service for the next basically for that 4 years. So maybe looking at ways that we can have more even distribution of the workload, right? The structure that I described, especially when you put those boards in between the voters' assembly and the church council, creates some decision making flow unclarity. So who decides certain things? This is a question that comes up regularly. Is this something that the board can decide, or do we need to have the church council decide, or do the voters need to make this decision? And so you just kind of well, let's have this group make this decision and see if anybody has an issue with it, and if we have to elevate it, we elevate it. So it's just not very clear. Um, Mostly because the our bylaws currently don't make it clear in as to where who's supposed to make these decisions, and then that goes along with communication. If you're not even sure who's supposed to make the decisions, how do you communicate some of your needs and desires and ideas and thoughts? In addition, just there's a lot of information to communicate. So even communication into these boards and then out of these boards isn't always as consistent and regular as we would like it to be. Another limitation is maybe it's preventing people from serving where their interests or skills lie. Um, the example that I've been using at our presentations is, let's say you have a man who loves his Lord, he loves his congregation, and he is really primarily interested in recognize he has a heart for trustee work. He recognizes that um, the we've been blessed as a congregation with our building, the land that we have, our cemetery, and loves taking care of that. So he serves as under on 4 years for the board of trustees, and then he has his year off. So okay, time to take a break. And when he comes back eligible to serve a year later, well, he's in Bible class all the time. So let's ask him to be on board of elders. And he may see the needs of the congregation and reluctantly agree to serve on the board of elders, but really where his heart and maybe his passion lies is in trustee work. And so we're kind of pigeonholing people to serve in certain areas and not giving them the freedom to serve where um with the gifts that maybe God has given them. In addition, we are also underutilizing the gifts of women in our congregation. Our women do a tremendous amount of work, but when it comes to our listening to the ideas that they might have for various things, it's sometimes hard to they probably don't feel included very often. And I guess maybe just to clarify what I mean here is that I was having a conversation with somebody in our kind of at our synodical level, and they said, the way that most Wells congregations approaches women, the service of women in our congregations, when it comes to the decisions that are being made, is husbands, make sure you talk to your wives before you come and vote. And also elders, make sure you talk to the single women and the widows and those that are maybe not represented, and make sure that you talk to them and that they're informed, and we can have their ideas coming in as well. Well, we might do the first one of those as far as husbands talking to their wives. We might do that all right, but we probably don't do the second one very well as far as reaching out and making sure that all of our people have a voice in the workings of the church. That's not to discount the fact that there are doctrinal principles of the roles of men and women, but um, there are certainly ways that people can serve, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the goals to address these limitations. But there's ways that you can serve without taking on authoritative roles. And then finally, we are a very reactive congregation, not a proactive congregation. So when we look at the goals that we might have with a new structure, first of all, we need to reduce the number of elected positions and probably significantly reduce the number of elected positions so that we can have um, be electing spiritually mature men to serve in these functions. And by spiritually mature, we're talking not about age; we're talking about spiritual maturity, so that we've got men that are in Bible class and are growing in their faith and knowledge of the Lord, that are able to serve, which spans all generations. Next, can we distribute the load on our elected officers? Can we distribute that responsibility and be more flexible in that distribution of the work? Next, can we clear up the decision making process and along with that simplify the flow of information? And then we have differentiating between authoritative functions and service oriented functions. This is relating back to people who's are maybe feeling prevented from serving where their skills are, underutilizing the gifts of women. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the differentiating between authoritative and service oriented functions. And then finally, can we become more proactive in our ministry planning? When you talk about being more proactive versus reactive, this is evident by just looking at um, how do you put your calendar together? How do you put your budget together? Well, we look at what we did last year, and we just fill out as best we can and hope we don't miss anything along the way. That's very reactive. You're doing it just before it needs to happen, as opposed to planning out your ministry. And so this structure is going to be dependent on being proactive. So what one thing that I did as we were preparing this work is to reach out to maybe half a dozen to a dozen members of the congregation and ask them to put together um, a list of things that they think about. Spend 5 minutes thinking about our congregation and the work that's being done, and to put together a list of the activity. Think about the work that's being done, the people that are serving, the people that are being served, and we came along with this massive list. And this probably doesn't encompass all the things now that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks as we bring this up as well. But at the top, you have just the boards that we have that are doing and committees that are doing some work. The next two lines, you've got Luther League and PTL, Women at the Well, Mornings with Mommy. These are groups that are meeting to grow in the Lord, or that are serving our congregation some way. And the ones in black are ones that maybe were mentioned that we could be doing or should be doing, but we aren't. And then all the lighter blue ones here, the boxes, are the actual activities that are taking place. So, we've got everything from evangelism to the running of a church library to how do we make sure that we've got the altar supplies for the candles and whatnot at the front of church. And then a couple of gray ones there are things that just that again we maybe recognize we could be doing better. Assimilation in the lower left hand corner, bringing new members in, and making sure they feel a part of the congregation, as an example. So what I did is I then took this and I rearranged it to try to start grouping things to the different boards. So you got items that are under the elders and items under kind of connected to the Board of Education. Even though they might not be doing these things, these are activities that are connected back up to that board. And we find that there's activities in the lower right-hand corner, especially there where you got communication and the church website and the church library that either if they're happening because somebody recognizes that they need to happen, but there's no particular group that is responsible for it. So it's being done by a couple of individuals that recognize the need, but there isn't any structure or necessarily planning that our elected leaders are influencing here. So can we find a way maybe to make sure that the activities of our congregation are all being supported um, in the work that's being done and by some of these boards and groups. So let's talk about what a new structure could possibly look like. The first thing that we need to recognize is that we operate under Christ, who is the head of the church, the Lord of the church. We submit to Christ in all things, and we can never ever forget that and let that go. And we need to hold on to that. That's Christ provides us our mission, and that's where we need to operate under. Within that, we've got two boxes, and we're going to talk about two different functions. Then I mentioned them before: the authoritative function and a service-oriented function. And when we are talking about these two things, the service-oriented function, what do we mean by that? We're talking about planning the work. We're talking about working the plan that's been approved, and we're the boots on the ground. The service-oriented function of the people that are doing the activity that's happening and the people that are doing all of the work in this congregation, right? But then there's the authoritative function, and that's the setting of direction, and that's approving the plan. That's so you've got maybe somebody planning the work, but then the authoritative function would be making a decision. Yes, this is the way that we're going to go. No, this is the plan that we're going to follow, and then the plan gets put into action. So if we put some names to these, we could say let's call the authoritative function a council of ministry. You could call it a church council as well. I've changed some of the names just so that it's clear to delineate from what we have today versus what we are considering. But a council of ministry then could serve as your authoritative function, and then we can have what we would call ministry action teams that could provide the services. So authoritative decision making on this council of ministry, who sits on that? Well, the pastor would first of all be on that board as an ex officio member, as well as when God blesses us with a principal. And from a decision-making process, we can decide too when God also blesses us with a second pastor that the whether both of them serve or they just in honor and respect of their time, maybe they decide who's going to serve 1 year versus another year. But those are members of this council of ministry, so we have some of the spiritual oversight. But they would be most likely non-voting members, and that is both the recommendation from the people that we're working with on the synod on this, as well as in talking with Pastor, he agrees that is probably the best way to approach this. And then the other members of the council of ministry would be men that are elected, and the number of men that are elected to these positions can vary. It depends on how many seats the congregation wants to have on. So our recommendation right now is to have 6 ministry officers. And notice that these ministry officers, we would only be electing men as a ministry officer. We're not electing them as a president or a vice president. They are coming in and as a ministry officer. And then the congregation can, by resolution, not a bylaws change, so it makes it much more flexible, by resolution say, you know what, these 6 men are overloaded. We need more men to be overseeing the work in the congregation. So let's make it 7 or let's make it 8. Um, and the reason for an even number is we do have a president, a vice president, a secretary, a treasurer, but they get together and they decide who's going to serve. One man say, I am willing and interested in serving as president of the congregation this year, and they work out who's going to do these different activities. And again, the reason for the even number, as I was going to mention, the president is usually not voting. So then you have a five members that would be voting, and then in the case of somebody abstaining and having a tie, the president can cast a vote to decide one way or the other. But that allows them to remain neutral in the discussions of the conversation. That's just a typical way to approach work that's happening on a board or an organization like this. So these ministry officers are the ones that work out what their gifts and skills are and who's going to be doing, what work, which allows a lot of flexibility because a year later, we'll have a couple of new members on the board and a couple of will come off and they'll re-meet. So you could technically have a president every year, but it might be supported by someone that was a president last year. They might say, listen, and I could envision, for example, in our current structure, Matthew saying, listen, I got through 2 years of COVID and I'm willing to continue to serve as a ministry officer, but I need a break from the work that's happening as president. And, somebody else could step in and say, I can support you on that. And maybe he takes the role of vice president for a year. So there's some flexibility, at least year to year, and even within the year, if necessary, that this work can be distributed amongst the men. So then we have to have below these service-oriented function with a number of action teams. And so we would be replacing I don't want to say we're replacing the boards with, let's say, Board of Elders or Board of Education with these ministry action teams, but we are replacing some of the work that those boards are doing, a lot of the work that those boards are doing with ministry action teams that take on that work. So we've got ministry action teams that we said are planning the work and working the plan, and the council of ministry that's the authoritative. Yes, this is the direction we're going to go. Yes, this is the plan we're going to put into action. So what does that look like? So the ministry action team planning some sort of work. It might be, for example, we could have a school team, for example, working on some school policy. So they do the groundwork in conversation with the Council of Ministry, which we'll talk about in a second. But they'll plan that work and present it to the Council of Ministry. The Council of Ministry takes a look at that, and they might have some areas of concern that they would like to see addressed. And so they send it back over to the ministry action team and say, here's some things we want you to work out on this. And then the ministry action team makes some adjustments and they bring it back to the Council of Ministry and they say, yes, you've addressed those things. We approve of that. And so they are making the decision that that's the policy that's going to get put into place. And then that ministry action team gets to working on that and putting it in place. And then throughout the year, then we're getting feedback so that we can prepare for next year's ministry plan to plan next year's work. So obviously, we're looking at a ministry action team and a council of ministry, and there's a lot of communication that's going to have to take place between those two. So, what does that look like? Well, between the council of ministry and the ministry action team, there's going to be some individuals that will be spearheading this communication. So every ministry action team has a coordinator that will be appointed by the Council of Ministry. Generally speaking, we would expect this to also be someone that would be eligible to serve on the Council of Ministry at some point. We're looking at these coordinators as leadership as a good leadership training ground, for example. But there may be situations where an action team is brought together that primarily serves women, or the work is not necessarily very authoritative in nature, and so there may be action teams where women can serve as well. But so you've got this coordinator on the ministry action team, and then every ministry action team will have one of those 6 ministry officers acting as their liaison to the council of ministry. So it's communication between the coordinator that's putting together reports and actually inviting the liaison to come in and sit in on the ministry action team meetings. When there's something actionable there, they want to make sure they're clearly communicating to that ministry officer. And that ministry officer takes that information to the council of ministry meetings where the decisions are being made. So if we take a step back and look at this organizational structure, we've got the council of ministry up on top that that's, let's say, roughly 6 men that have been elected, along with pastor and principal that are serving and bringing oversight into these ministry action teams. And every action team has a coordinator. I've got 10 ministry action teams here. We have no idea right now. If we were to move forward in this plan, that's a major piece of work that we need to do, is figure out what these action teams are, what we call them, and what the scope of their responsibility is. But every one of them, however many we have, is going to have a coordinator. And then you're going to have every one of them is going to have a liaison from the council of ministry. And no, we've got 10 action groups and 8, let's say, council of ministry members here. Some ministry officers or councilmen might be the liaison for 2 or more ministry action teams. So those ones that aren't serving as a president or a vice president or a treasurer may be taking on a little bit more of the oversight of these ministry action teams. So let's put some names to these action teams. So you might have, for example, a soul care team, and they might be taking on, let's say, some of the responsibilities that the elders take care of today. So, for example, we've in the past had what we call the Peter Plan, where a group of volunteers were willing to be given names of people that hadn't been in church in a few weeks and say, can you just reach out to them, check up and see if they're doing okay. We want to make sure that everything's all right with them, and see if there's anything that's preventing them from being able to make it to church, because we are concerned about their spiritual growth. And that the Peter Plan volunteers would contact those people and again check up and say, hey, just checking in and make sure everything's okay. Well, that work could really be coordinated by a soul care team, where they're the ones that are helping track attendance, and they are recognizing the people that have been absent for a few weeks and say, hey, let's just reach out and see if everything's okay. Another aspect of the elder work is planning out worship from the perspective of especially setting schedules. Like, when are we going to have Christmas services, since Christmas Eve falls on a Sunday this year? Planning out when we're going to have one service or both services for Christmas Eve morning, for example. Well, now that could be taking place under a worship planning team that might be doing some of that work. And maybe that worship planning team takes on some of the creating of the PowerPoints, which some volunteers are doing right now, just as examples. So none of these groups are a one-for-one replacement for the boards that would no longer exist, but they're taking on some of the action. Of course, for example, the elders, part of their responsibility is in those cases when it comes up, is church discipline, and that would be something that still remains as an authoritative function with the council of ministry. So you're not asking somebody, a soul care team isn't doing all of the elder work. They're just doing the part that is assigned to them. So within that, I've just got a number of other names. A school team could be doing some of the work that the Board of Education has been doing, and maybe working towards policy in scheduling and making sure and running the school registration process. some I guess different areas around the school. Campus care team could be what we call our trustees today. Maybe we would have a stewardship team that could be focusing on kind of the things that our finance board does today, as far as counting the offerings, encouraging stewardship. Maybe they take on some other responsibilities, maybe things that we're not even doing right now. Finance team, in the case of Trinity and Waukesha, at least, they have a finance team, and they are actually the ones that are helping the other teams put their budgets together. And then the other couple teams I have on here as a communications team, which is of interest with the people in our district that we would be having to go through this process of setting up the bylaws with. We're interested in St. John's maybe testing out the idea of having a communications team to help bring consistency to our communications. Maybe we have a long range planning team, right? Okay, so putting this into action, we got a calendar. And what we would be doing is taking our annual meeting, and that would be this new constitution and bylaws would call for one business meeting a year, where that the voters sit down collectively to carry out some work. And we would probably try to set that in that June July timeframe, so that we would be setting ourselves up on the full fiscal year schedule. So not only are we approving the budget in July, but we would also elect our officers. And I guess I should also mention right now, the plan would probably be to have those ministry officers serve for 3 years. And then 2 of them would come off every year. So every year, your ballot is 2 men instead of 20 or more men. Or I should say, electing 2 positions instead of 15 to 20 positions. As far as the voters go, they would very clearly describe what decisions the congregation needs to make, the voters need to make, right? And what they are delegating, and then they delegate the rest of that to the Council of Ministry to make those authoritative actions throughout the year. This would be encouraging then a proactive ministry. So we would replace the quarterly meetings with open forums, and then have our business meeting in, let's say, that June, July timeframe. So sometime in that February and March area, then is what would start that annual ministry planning. So that's when the events for our calendar year, the systems that we're putting in place, the schedule that we're setting, and the budget to carry out the ministry of St. John's is set by those teams under objectives that have been set by the ministry officers and objectives that haven't been evaluated by our pastors. Right? So we get to the business meeting, and 3 things are reserved for the voters to do for sure at that meeting. 1 is to elect the new leaders. 2 would be to approve the ministry plan that the ministry action teams and the council have set. And then 3 would be to approve the budget to support that work. Those are the 3 things that the voters would decide in that meeting. This is going ahead to saying, you know what, we'll know in July when churches, when our services for the holiday season are going to be. We'll know when Unity Sunday is going to be. We'll know when, we've set these things in advance. And then the other quarterly meetings become open forums that everybody's encouraged to attend, so we can have the ministry action teams presenting the work that they've done. Where they're at in the process, as well as what needs to be done yet this year, and then maybe ideas as they start getting into the ministry planning for the next year. They can be bringing up ideas that they are floating around, and then that allows an idea of consensus to be brought. So this is very important. Part of this setup is that this is a consensus building setup where you want to be engaging ideas with people early on, so they can get better direction and better details. Um, Generally speaking, the Council of Ministry would meet monthly. The action teams meet as needed. Some might meet monthly or maybe even more often, depending on what they're doing. Some might be, only meeting a couple times a year. Um, and then anytime that they're going to be meeting to talk about actionable items, the ministry officer that's their liaison should be attending that meeting. And then additional business meetings, another thing that the congregation reserves for itself as a voting body would be call meetings, for example, or a meeting to purchase land or embark on a building project. These major projects are things that the voters would reserve for themselves. That's not being delegated to the 6 Council of Ministry members. The last thing I want to just emphasize, is that at certain times, there may be a reason to designate or delegate that authoritative function into a portion of those ministry action teams. I think a great example right now might be if you think back to COVID, for example, the Council of Ministry with changing legislation happening all the time. The Council of Ministry, if we had this set up then, might have looked and said, listen, there's so much happening at the government level right now. New, the laws are changing constantly, or the guidance that we're having. So we need to figure out how to enact that, and we can't be sitting here waiting for the school team. We can't be making these decisions monthly. We need to be more reactive than that. So let's appoint men from the school team to act as a board of education, specifically with the task of A, B, C, and D. So they would define, the scope of their authoritative, responsibility. But then that even if it's considered temporary, that board of education would be the ones that could take on and be making decisions as how to implement the guidance from our government in the case of that pandemic, right? So at any time, if the Council of Ministry says, wow, there's a lot of things happening here that we just can't, we're falling behind in our work, we need to have some people that have that authoritative decision-making ability. And again, members that would be eligible to serve on a Council of Ministry. We're going to have a board of elders or a board of education that would be appointed. Our recommendation is that we not start by appointing those, but again, those are year-by-year appointments, just like the Council of Ministry is a year-by-year. It's going to change every year, and so that allows some flexibility. When the work is a little bit more, you can say, okay, you guys, we're going to give you the responsibility of making authoritative decisions in this area. And when that area is kind of done, or the activity subsides, thank you for your work. You can go back to being just members of that school team without that authoritative function. So again, provides a lot of flexibility. So that's kind of the what we've got for a presentation. There's probably a lot more that could be said, and that's where we would love to have you join us at our open forum again, November 15th, Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Location is still yet to be decided, if that'll be in the church sanctuary or if it'll be in the cafeteria, but it should be in one of those two places. So thank you again you've made it to the end of this, almost 45-minute long presentation. But we really appreciate you listening to this and encourage you to come with your questions. What we need now is the challenges of what would we do in this situation? How would this organizational structure handle that situation? And the challenging ones. Our district president said constitution and bylaws are often written in thinking of the optimal way things work, but it really is being written to handle and give a guide on when things go wrong. And so we need to have those examples to how would this information flow? How would this work? So if you can come up with those ideas and even bring some of those to the open forum, we would love that. So thanks again for that, and we hope to see you soon.